You notice it in a moment that doesn't seem important enough to remember later. Nothing dramatic is happening. You're not overwhelmed, not relieved, not searching for answers. Yet something inside you pauses, almost by accident. Your thoughts don't stop completely. They just lose their urgency. They pass without demanding a response. It feels unfamiliar, but not alarming. Like standing in a room you've lived in for years and suddenly realizing how quiet it is when no one is speaking. You're still aware of everything around you. The weight of your body, the space you occupy, the subtle movement of time continuing as usual. But there's a gap now. A small distance between you and the constant inner commentary you've grown used to. You don't name it. You don't try to hold it. You simply notice that something has shifted without announcing itself. And even as life continues normally on the outside, this quiet pause lingers just long enough to make you wonder whether it's always been there, waiting for you to stop leaning forward into the next thought. The pause doesn't disappear the next time you expect it to. It returns unexpectedly. Between tasks, between words, between moments where you would usually be filling the space. You realize how often you move through your days slightly ahead of yourself. Anticipating. Adjusting. Preparing for what comes next before the present one finishes. Now, for brief stretches, that momentum softens. You still function. You still respond. But something inside no longer rushes to interpret every sensation. Emotions arise, but they don't pull as hard. Thoughts appear, but they don't immediately ask to be believed. There's a strange neutrality in this. Not peaceful enough to be comforting. Not unsettling enough to be concerning. Just open. You notice how silence feels different from emptiness. Emptiness asks to be filled. This doesn't. It simply exists, unnoticed until now, quietly altering how close you feel to your own inner noise. And once you notice that distance, it becomes harder to ignore the possibility that you were never meant to be so tightly entangled with every passing thought. The world doesn't change to match this internal shift. People speak the same way. Situations unfold with the same unpredictability. Yet your involvement feels altered. You catch yourself observing reactions before they fully form. A familiar irritation starts to rise, then stalls halfway, unsure whether it needs to continue. It's not that you suppress it. It simply doesn't receive the same energy. You become aware of how much effort used to go into maintaining certain emotional patterns. The subtle tension in anticipation, the reflex to prepare defenses, the habit of narrating your own experience as it happens. Now, that narration weakens. Moments don't ask to be framed so tightly. They pass with less resistance. This creates an unexpected sensation of disorientation. If you're not constantly reinforcing your reactions, what exactly is steering the experience? You don't answer that question. You just notice how often it arises when the usual inner activity slows. The quiet doesn't explain itself. It simply stays present long enough to make you aware of how loud your internal world used to be. At some point, you realize this stillness isn't something you enter. It's something that appears when something else steps aside. The effort to stay engaged. The reflex to judge. The impulse to control how each moment should feel. Without those, awareness feels wider. Less focused on outcomes, less preoccupied with meaning. Time feels different here. Not slower. Not faster. Just less fragmented. You notice how often you used to check yourself against an internal standard. How you should be feeling, what this moment should be doing for you. Now, those checks occur less frequently. There's a subtle loss of interest in certain mental habits. Not rejection. Not resistance. Just a quiet fading. This absence creates space. And within that space, you sense something steady. Not an emotion, not a thought, but a kind of background presence that doesn't fluctuate with circumstances. You don't fully recognize it yet. But it feels familiar in a way you can't explain, as if it's been carrying you long before you noticed it. The opening pause returns again, but this time you recognize it. Not as an event, but as a state that doesn't require effort to maintain. You see how inner stillness doesn't interrupt life. It runs alongside it, untouched by urgency. Challenges still appear. Uncertainty still exists, but they no longer feel as intimate. You begin to sense the difference between being involved and being entangled, between experiencing emotion and being consumed by it. This distinction isn't intellectual. It's felt. There's a growing awareness that your sense of self doesn't fluctuate as wildly as you once believed. That something within you remains unchanged even as moods, thoughts, and circumstances move freely. You don't cling to this realization. Clinging would disturb it. Instead, you let it remain in the background. Quiet, stable, unremarkable. And in doing so, you start to understand why this stillness is rarely noticed. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't ask to be admired. It simply continues, whether you acknowledge it or not. Only now does the opening moment begin to settle into coherence. That initial pause wasn't a break from yourself. It was a brief return. The silence wasn't empty. It was unoccupied. You see how much of your inner life was shaped by constant engagement. Fixing, interpreting, reinforcing identity through activity. Stillness reveals something quieter but more stable than effort. A presence that doesn't need to react to remain intact. This is where its power lives. Not in force, not in control, but in its independence from mental noise. You don't feel compelled to protect it. You know now it doesn't disappear when ignored. It remains available, patient, unchanging. Not as an escape from life, but as the ground life unfolds upon. The experience doesn't conclude. It doesn't need to. It simply continues. As awareness does. Steady, silent, carrying everything without comment long after the last thought fades.